Aristotle spent years mapping the exact measure of every human virtue. He believed there was a right amount of anger, a precise kind, aimed at the right person for the right reason. And yet he lived his entire adult life inside institutions that could dismiss him, exile him, or have him killed. The academy, the Macedonian court, the Lyceum, he moved between them. He never controlled any of them. The man who taught the world how anger should be felt was always, in some way, at the mercy of more powerful men. That is the strange thing sitting at the center of his thinking. He insisted that a person who never gets angry is morally deficient. That righteous anger is a sign of good character, not a failure of it. But was he really in a position to know? Or was that the wisdom of someone who had just enough safety to afford it? You have probably felt this pull yourself. Something happens at work, at a table, in a conversation, and your anger rises, and you think it is completely fair. Maybe it is, but some small part of you wonders whether you are responding to the situation or simply to your own pride. That question is very old. Aristotle sat with it too. He never quite resolved it. Neither, perhaps, should we. He was 17 when he arrived in Athens, an outsider from the northern edge of the Greek world. His father had been a doctor to the Macedonian king. Both parents were already dead, so the boy came alone, carrying nothing but his mind, to the city that believed it held civilization's center of gravity. He joined Plato's academy, and he stayed. For 20 years he stayed. He read everything. He questioned everything. He became, by almost any measure, the sharpest thinker in that building, perhaps in that city. Now picture yourself there. You are 22. You are foreign-born in a place where that still matters enormously. You work harder than the people beside you. You see further. You follow the arguments further. And you wait. Then Plato dies. The academy needs a new head. Everyone knows who the intellectual heir is. Everyone in that room has watched him for 2 decades. They choose someone else, a nephew, a man whose bloodline connects directly to Plato. Sit with that for a moment, just sit with it. You have given 20 years. You have earned it by every reasonable measure, and it goes to someone else, not for what he has done, but for who he was born to. What moves through you in that moment? Is it unreasonable, or is it the most reasonable thing in the world? Aristotle left Athens. He left and did not come back for more than a decade. He went to the coast of Asia Minor. He went to the island of Lesbos. He studied tide pools and the movement of fish. He built a life that looked, from the outside, like retreat. But something was happening internally. Something was being turned over. Because here is what Aristotle did not do. He did not decide that what he felt was shameful. He did not bury it under philosophy. He did not conclude that the wise man feels nothing. Instead, he began to ask a harder question, not whether the feeling was legitimate, but whether acting on it, how, when, toward whom, whether that could be done well or badly, whether there was a right way and a wrong way to be angry. That is a different question entirely.
The least initial deviation from the truth is later 1,000-fold.
He was talking about logic when he wrote that, about arguments that go wrong at the start and spiral outward into disaster. But he had also just lived it. A small deviation, one decision made on bloodline instead of merit, and the ripple went through everything. Through his career, through his relationship to Athens, through the question he would spend the rest of his life trying to answer. The man who would eventually write the most precise account of anger ever composed was not a man who theorized from a comfortable distance. He was a man who knew what it felt like to have something taken, and who could not quite settle, even then, whether what burned in him was wisdom or wound. Imagine you have spent years thinking carefully about something that matters, how to treat people fairly, how to lead well. You have worked it out slowly through argument and experience. You believe you know what it looks like when someone gets it right. Then someone you trusted, someone you taught, does the opposite, publicly, in a way that cannot be explained away. You are standing there. What do you feel? Most of us say anger, but sit with it for a moment longer, because it is not quite that clean, is it? There is anger at them. There is something that might be shame. There is the particular, quiet sting of watching your own framework fail in a real room with real consequences. And underneath all of it, a question you do not want to ask. Were you wrong? Or were you right and it simply was not enough? Aristotle knew this feeling, not as a thought experiment, as a life. He had spent decades building one of the most precise accounts of human virtue the ancient world had ever seen. He believed anger was not a weakness. He believed it was necessary. That a person who felt no anger in the face of genuine injustice was not calm, they were deficient. Something in them had gone quiet that should have stayed loud. But he also believed that anger, like everything else, had to be measured. The right amount. The right moment. The right reason. Directed at the right person. The man who fails to meet that standard is not righteous. He is simply reactive. And the man who always meets that standard, what kind of life does he have to be living? What kind of power does he have to hold to make the measure that fine?
Knowledge of the fact differs from knowledge of the reason for the fact.
He wrote that, and he meant it as a distinction about science, about how we understand the world. But listen to it again in the context of anger. You can know that you are angry. That is the fact. The reason, what the anger is truly about, what it is protecting, what it is hiding, that is a different kind of knowledge entirely. Aristotle lived inside courts and academies, places built on hierarchy, on favor, on the goodwill of men who held more power than he did. He watched his own students diverge from everything he had taught. He watched his patron's empire crack. He watched himself leave Athens not once but twice, the second time, near the end of his life under threat. You do not design a perfect architecture of righteous anger from a position of perfect safety. You design it from the inside of a world that would test it constantly. And perhaps that is exactly the point. The framework was not built in a library. It was built under pressure by someone who knew what pressure felt like and who refused to let it make the framework simple. Because the man who only gets angry when it costs him nothing, that is not virtue. That is comfort wearing virtue's clothes. And Aristotle knew the difference. He spent his whole life trying to hold it. You are in a meeting. Someone cuts across you mid-sentence. They finish your thought or what they think is your thought and the room moves on. You feel something. It moves fast. It is already there before you have named it. What do you do with it? Most of us have two instincts. Swallow it and say nothing, or let it show and watch what happens. Aristotle thought both of those were wrong, not because he was a mild man who believed in keeping the peace. He was not. He thought they were wrong because they both missed what the feeling was actually telling you. He asked a simpler question first. Did they mean it? Not did it sting, it clearly did. But did the person across the table intend to diminish you, or were they just quick, just excited, just not paying attention? That distinction mattered enormously to him. Anger, he argued, is always a response to a perceived slight. The word he used meant something like contempt, being treated as if you did not count. So the first thing to ask is whether that contempt was actually there. Because if it was not, your anger has found the wrong address. And Aristotle thought misdirected anger was not just unfortunate. He thought it was a kind of moral error. But say it was intentional. Say you look across the table and you know the way you sometimes just know that it was deliberate. Now the second question arrives. What would a proportionate response look like? Not what would feel satisfying, not what would restore your dignity in the most visible way. What would actually fit what happened? Notice what that question does to the feeling in your chest. It does not dissolve it, it focuses it. It makes it ask something of itself. This is the move Aristotle made that almost nobody expected. He did not say anger was a weakness. He did not say it clouded judgment. He said anger was a perception. It was the mind registering that something of value had been treated as worthless. When it is accurate, it is not an obstacle to clear thinking. It is part of clear thinking. The person who feels nothing when they are genuinely wronged is not calm. They are, in Aristotle's view, deficient. They are not seeing what is actually there.
Nature does not do anything in vain.
He believed that deeply, and he applied it here. Anger exists because it serves something. It marks violations. It signals that a line was crossed. Strip it out entirely and you lose the ability to register when something real has been lost. But here is where the tension refuses to go away. Aristotle spent decades living inside institutions where he was never fully in charge. The academy, the Macedonian court, the Lyceum, which he built on borrowed land under borrowed permission. He knew what it was to depend on the goodwill of powerful men. So when he said anger is a moral perception, when he said the wise person feels it at the right time, toward the right person, in the right measure, you have to wonder, did he know how much harder that is when you are not the one who holds the room? The question he left open was not abstract. It is the one you are already asking yourself, right now, about that meeting. Think of someone you know who is angry, not briefly irritated, not venting after a bad day, genuinely, persistently angry at something real, something done to them or to people they love. You have probably had this thought about them. Maybe you have even said it. They need to let it go. It is eating them alive. Aristotle asks you to stop right there, not because he disagrees with your concern, but because he thinks you are answering too fast. Before you ask whether the anger is helping them, he wants you to ask something harder. Is the anger accurate? Is it pointing at a real wrong? And if it is, what would the right expression of it actually look like? That is where his framework gets interesting and where it gets difficult, because Aristotle believed that anger at its best is a kind of moral perception. It sees a wrong and names it. It says, this matters. To feel nothing in the face of genuine injustice is not calm. It is closer to blindness. He had a word for that failure too. A person who cannot be roused when they should be is not virtuous. They are simply absent. So the goal was never to extinguish anger. The goal was to aim it correctly. The right object, the right degree, the right moment. He called the person who managed this praiseworthy, almost admirable. But here is where you have to push back, and you should push back, because Aristotle is describing something that requires a kind of steadiness, a kind of room inside yourself that sustained, grinding oppression tends to destroy. The person carrying decades of real harm does not always have the luxury of calibrating their response. They are not failing at virtue. They are exhausted. And when a philosopher who spent his life inside courts and academies tells them their anger needs to be proportionate and well-timed, you can feel what that costs to hear. Aristotle knew this, at least in part. He understood that the capacity to reason well about your own situation depends on what your situation has done to you. He wrote that we know the particular through sense, through lived, bodily experience, not through abstract principles, which means the person inside the wrong is not working from the same ground as someone observing it from a distance.
You is known according to reason, but that which is particular according to sense.
Read that slowly. He is not saying reason is unreliable. He is saying the particular is only available through experience, the specific texture of a specific wrong that lives in the body of the person who felt it, not in a framework built at a comfortable remove. So his real answer to the objection is not a dismissal. It is a deepening. The framework does not override the person inside the situation. It demands that we take their particular experience seriously before we say a single word about proportion. The anger might be accurate. It might be the most precise moral instrument in the room. And if it is, the question shifts. Not, should they be angry, but what would the world have to look like for this anger to finally have somewhere to go? That is a much harder question. And Aristotle, to his credit, does not look away from it. He simply cannot answer it from where he is standing. Think of an anger you are carrying right now. It does not have to be a dramatic one. It might be something from last week, a conversation that went wrong, a decision someone made that affected you and you had no say in it, something small that should have passed but hasn't. You know the one. It is still there when you are quiet enough to feel it. Now hold it for a moment. Don't explain it away. Don't defend it. Just let it sit. Aristotle would look at that anger and ask you a very simple question. He would ask, is it tracking something real? Not is it comfortable, not is it polite. Is it pointing at something that actually happened, something that actually matters? If a wrong was done, anger is not a flaw in your character. It is a signal. It is the part of you that knows. But here is where it gets harder. He would ask a second question. And this one you cannot answer as quickly. What are you doing with it? Where is it moving? Is it moving toward something, toward repair, toward accountability, toward a truth that needs to be said? Or is it circling? Is it feeding on itself? Is it building a case, rehearsing a verdict, returning to the same moment again and again, not to understand it but to feel it again? That second question is not comfortable, because most of us, if we are honest, have felt both things in the same anger. The part that is right, and the part that has started doing something else entirely. Aristotle knew this. He lived inside institutions built on the power of other men. He taught in a school he did not own. He shaped a king's son and watched that son remake the world without asking him. He built a second school, gathered his students, poured everything he had into that work, and then one accusation, one shift of political wind, and he had to leave or die. He left. He died a year later. A man who wrote with such precision about righteous anger, about knowing the right measure, about directing it at the right person in the right way. That man spent his whole life at the mercy of rooms he could not control.
The least initial deviation from the truth is later a thousandfold.
He wrote that about science, about how a small error at the beginning becomes an enormous one at the end. But it is true of anger too. A small misdirection early on, a slight exaggeration of what happened, a quiet decision to stop listening, and by the time the anger has fully formed, it may be pointing somewhere it was never meant to go. That is the thing Aristotle could not fully resolve. And neither can we. You can know the standard. You can hold it clearly in your mind. The right cause, the right degree, the right person, the right time. And still in the moment when you are inside it, when the heat is actual and the grievance is real, you are never entirely sure which part is wisdom and which part is just you wanting to be right. Aristotle had every reason to be angry at the end. Whether his anger was righteous, whether it tracked something real and moved toward something good, or whether it circled, we do not know. He did not leave us that. What he left us is the question, the anger you are carrying, the one you were thinking of a moment ago. Is it tracking something real? And is what you are doing with it moving toward repair, or is it moving toward something else? You do not have to answer tonight, but notice what it feels like to ask. So we arrive back where we started. A man who spent decades measuring the exact middle point of every human feeling. A man who taught that anger, handled well, is not a flaw but a form of clarity. A man who lived, for much of his life, inside the walls of institutions built by other men's money and other men's decisions. He was a guest at the academy, a guest at the Macedonian court, and in the end, a guest in a city that would turn on him the moment politics shifted. He never quite held the keys. And so you have to wonder, just quietly, not as an accusation, whether the calm precision of his theory was something he earned through honest reckoning, or something he could afford because there was always a door he could still walk out of. That is not a simple question. It doesn't dissolve. Because the alternative isn't comfortable either. If only the powerless may judge their own anger, then the powerful are always wrong and the suffering are always right. And you know, somewhere in yourself, that it doesn't work that way either. So here is where he leaves you. Not with a rule, not with a formula, but with something harder, a task that has to be done fresh each time without a net. The next time you feel it rising, that heat, that certainty, you'll have a moment, a very small one. And in that moment, the question isn't whether anger is acceptable. The question is whether you actually know yourself well enough to trust your own account of it. Whether the story you're telling is true, or whether it's the story that happens to be most convenient for you right now, in this particular room, where you happen to hold a certain amount of power. Aristotle left that one open. He may have had his reasons.